Moving on, so quickly on the SEC itself, there are 6 principal divisions at the SEC. The one you probably see the most is the one on the far left, the enforcement division. When you see cases against big Wall Street banks, against brokers, against investment managers, those are being brought by the enforcement division, voted on by the commission, but investigated by enforcement. Examination, which is where I worked for half the time I was at the SEC, where you're going out and examining investment advisors, broker-dealers, transfer agents, credit rating agencies, national securities exchanges. There are more entities registered with the SEC than I ever knew before I went there. Investment management, where I ended up, which is the division that writes the rules around mutual funds, hedge funds, private equity funds, all of the investment vehicles that you've heard of. And in particular, in the division of investment management, what's so important there is that that's the division that is in charge of the rules for mutual funds. The majority of America accesses markets in the United States through mutual funds. That's why the Investment Company Act was created in 1940, was to have a safe method for the average investor to access public markets, and that's what mutual funds are. And so the United States is critically important. Every single speech I gave as Director of Investment Management talked about the fact that people are saving in those mutual funds for very important things in their lives, right? Their kids' college education, to buy a home, for their retirement, whatever it is, it's serious business. And it was a very serious mission to be at the SEC and try to make sure that those funds are operating on behalf of investors. Now, remember, that's not that those funds will make money, right? This is about markets and this is about risk. But it is that those funds will be safe for investors. So no one is stealing the money that's in there. The people who are running those funds are running it the way they told you they would run it. And in particular with mutual funds, there are some leverage limits and transaction limits that are meant to make mutual funds safe for everyday investors. So that's what we're doing in investment management. The other 3 divisions, economic and risk analysis, every time the commission goes to do something, pass a rule, it has to analyze the economics of that rule, and so that's what those folks do. And then trading and markets is the equivalent to investment management, but for broker-dealers. So Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, all the different brokers you've heard of are regulated by trading and markets. And then corporation finance is the division that is the equivalent for public companies. So we have more than 12,000 public companies in the United States. Corporation finance writes the rules and reviews the filings of those companies to make sure those companies are telling the truth to investors and that accurate disclosure is getting out into the market. Okay, so that's a little overview of the SEC. What did we find when we got there? So I got there in the very beginning of 2010. We were faced with the fallout from the financial crisis in the United States, fall of 2008. There was a movement to get a lot of people into the agency. Obviously, a lot of people who had been there during the crisis left. There was administration change, but also a number of people left because of the various things that had happened at the SEC. And so we came into the SEC at a time of great change, a time of great uncertainty. Crisis was still raging. The fallout from the crisis was raging in the sense that the Inspector General of the SEC was issuing reports right and left about all the failures at the SEC during the crisis and pre-crisis. We had the press calling up all the time. We had Congress calling up all the time. It was a spicy time at the SEC. But it also gave us an opportunity to make some changes in an organization that is very bureaucratic, just like most government agencies. It gave us a window to undertake some change that I, frankly, not sure when that window will come around again. I hope it doesn't come around again with another crisis with a lot of failures by the SEC. But it did give us a chance to make a bunch of changes at the Commission, so I'll talk a little bit about some of those and how we went about that, because I actually think now the administration coming in, and I know they want to make a lot of changes in what's going on in the government, and it's a challenging place for change. So I think hopefully some of them will read the book and understand some of the issues with change. So some of them, probably the single most surprising thing in the securities world that we live in as regulated entities, if you're at a regulated entity or as a lawyer advising them, one of the critical requirements is that you have a manual that lays out how you are going to do your business, what controls you're going to have, how you're going to make sure that clients' money is kept safely, how you're going to comply with the federal securities laws. Early on, realized that inside the SEC, we didn't have anything like that. So we had no manuals about how we were going to do our job as examiners. We had pieces about how certain issues would be examined. So how are we going to look at assets at a firm and so forth, but no overarching manual for the division. And one of the things I say in the book, no one seemed to notice the irony, because if we had gone into a firm and they had no manual, we'd probably just stop the exam right there and send those folks off to the enforcement division for their settlement with the SEC. But here we were with no manuals of how we did things. So one of the things we did in both the investment management division and in the exam division was get in place manuals, policies and procedures for the division. How do we do things? Who reports to whom? What can you how does it all work? That sounds a little mundane and a little bureaucratic itself, that we're going to get manuals in place, but two quick examples of how really deadly serious it was. So first one, when examiners were looking at Bernie Madoff 15 years, Jim? 12 years, 15 years before his fraud was discovered, a time when he maybe had under $1 billion. Examiners they drafted a letter to the options exchange. And that letter said, please send us all of Mr. Madoff's trading records. That draft letter still exists in the files of the SEC. It was never sent. It was never sent because people worried about getting too much material back from the exchange and how we're going to review it. We don't really have time. Obviously, had that letter been sent, he wasn't trading at all, right? He was just stealing the money. And so Madoff would have been wound up tens of billions of dollars before he was eventually captured. So imagine the number of people whose savings were wiped out, life savings, right? The personal tragedy involved in that. Not surprisingly, the manual says when you go to a firm, you've got to make sure that they're actually doing the business that they say they're doing, right? Again, sounds pretty routine, but there it is. Similarly, the other great scandal that really devastated the SEC was a man named Stanford in Texas, who was running really just a modern variation on something we call a prime bank scheme. I don't know if people have heard of the prime bank scheme. Prime bank scheme involves, I tell you that I have a bank that will pay 12% interest on certificates of deposit. Now, we all know if we watch around upstairs, most banks are paying 1% max on certificates of deposit, but I have a special bank that's paying 12% interest. In Mr. Stanford's case, the special bank was in Antigua, an island in the Caribbean. And of course, it was a complete scam from start to finish. He was stealing all the money, buying cricket teams, traveling all around the world. Examiners examined him for the very first time about 14 years before he was discovered. And again, he had maybe $200 million. Examiners wrote a report saying, this guy's running a Ponzi scheme, right? $20 billion before he was caught. So his scale's not quite as big as Madoff. But they wrote a report saying, this guy's running a Ponzi scheme. And you can see that note in the records. And enforcement would not take the case. People in the office, well, it's too hard. How are we going to look at Antigua? It's too complicated. And so examiners filed that report away in a paper file saying this guy's running a Ponzi scheme. Again, not surprisingly, the manual says that if you find fraud at an investment advisor and guess what you think is going on, you have to escalate that up the chain of command and find someone to listen to you, including all the way up to the people we had at escalation procedures, all the way up to the people running the divisions. So manuals sound mundane, but they contain the kinds of things that would have prevented the Stanford and Madoff disasters, disasters that obviously cost investors tens of billions of dollars. And in both cases, we're not talking about necessarily sophisticated institutional investors, we're talking about individuals who lost their life savings. So serious business. A couple other things about change at the SEC and some of the challenges we faced. As I say in the book, we had a lack of both carrots and sticks, right? So people in the government can't be very much rewarded on the upside for their effort, nor can they ever be fired or effectively disciplined. So this is a result of civil service statutes and the union collective bargaining agreement. Effectively, if you get a federal civilian job, you are a Supreme Court justice, right? Because you can never be fired. I recount there were 2 people ever that I saw fired in 5 years, and happily, sort of a confluence of time, USA Today ran an article while we were there saying you have a far better chance of dying in your federal job than of being fired. So that kind of summed it up. Now, I looked at the situation, right, and I was there. Mayor Shapiro asked us to go there to try to change the agency and try to overcome these exam failures. And so you could really choose one of two tracks. You could choose a track of raging at the machine and saying, you know, this thing is so horrible, in which case, you know, you would come and go and not get anything changed, right? Or, you know, I decided early on, put aside the absurdity, sat down with the union heads. They had a lot of issues that they wanted addressed as well. They wanted more training for their folks. They had, you know, issues that they wanted to address. We had issues that we wanted to address. And so we sat down and made common cause with the heads of the public employee union, and we were able to change not only the manuals, reorganize both divisions I worked in, and I have some slides on what we did, but really the necessity there of working with them, because they had been there long before I got there. They were going to be there long after I left. And so I really thought, hey, let's try to change this thing for the better of American investors. Let's all work together. And so we were able to do so. I'll detail some of those changes. And, you know, the last point, despite, you know, as was said in the introduction, despite the difficulties and despite some of these things, there are people there who are working 24/7 to protect you, to protect your investments, to make sure that someone's not stealing from you. People tirelessly devoting their effort to make people's, again, not guarantee returns, but make sure that no one is stealing, no one's committing misconduct with your investments. And it's really for those folks that we really tried to change things, empower them, give them processes and procedures to do things the right way. Without a manual, you know, if you're a person on a team and you say this is a Ponzi scheme and there's no written policy and procedures, nothing to do with that, you really don't have, you know, how can you escalate that? What's right? Whereas if you give people transparency, give them a process for escalating, then you can empower them to fulfill their mission. So they're the real heroes. The book is dedicated to the quiet patriots at the SEC who triumph despite the obstacles. So that's life at the SEC. Some of the changes talked about in the exam division. I would say maybe the biggest single thing, although I see two exam vets here now, so they can offer their thoughts. But I would say number one, bringing in a lot more expertise. So I was the first person, I think, hired at the SEC who had been a partner in a hedge fund. I think they thought I was going to show up with, like, you know, horns and like a tail. There was, wait, he's coming from a hedge fund. It was a very concerning thing. Had to go all the way to Mary Shapiro, all the way to the chair to hire me in New York. He's coming from a hedge fund, we're just not sure. So we brought in a lot more experts, people who'd been in the industry. We brought a lot of those people in on temporary appointments to try to get them to come in when their knowledge was fresh, but not stay too long, because that is one of the issues with the lifetime employment stuff is people stay a long, long time. Very hard to stay fresh in that, you know, when you've been there for decades. So we brought in a lot more expertise. The exam reports, as I mentioned, had been filed in paper copies in local offices. That made it very hard to understand what was going on. Say you're doing an exam in LA and I'm in New York, you know, I got to get you maybe to FedEx me an exam report that might relate to one of my exams. So we got an automated exam report system across the whole country. Everyone could see the exam reports. Everyone could see what firms were doing, start to try to pull out, you know, facts that they might need among the different offices. So